Good morning, everyone. I'd like to start this panel. My name is John Condis, and I'm a partner at the law firm of Allen Matkins in Irvine here in California, and I specialize in land use and environmental permitting and environmental law. And of course, Allen Matkins, if you're not aware, has one of the largest real estate law practices in the country, although we are a California-based firm. This should be an interesting panel. We're going to be exploring the regulatory environment and its effects on development from a national perspective, but with a special emphasis on California, because first, we are in California, and secondly, because California probably has the most complicated regulatory system in the country. Our discussion is not going to merely focus on regulatory trends, but we're also going to try to provide some takeaways and solutions to some of these problems. So it's not all going to be negative, hopefully. We have a great panel of developers with significant national experience in addressing these types of regulatory issues. In terms of some rules of the road, two things. One, if people are going to ask questions, and there will be a Q&A at the end, I've been told to remind everyone to please go to the mic and speak because the session is being recorded. And so what we're going to do is we're going to hear initially from all four panelists, then we'll maybe have a little discussion among the panelists, and then we'll open it up to questions and answers. Before introducing the panelists, I thought I'd just spend a couple of minutes on kind of laying out some of the things that we're seeing and I'm seeing in my practice here in California. Obviously, logistics and warehouse development is strong, but as you might expect, it's getting harder and harder to get approvals from the local governments. Local governments now are doing a lot better economically, so they're not as amenable to logistics projects as they have been in the past. And they're not incentivized to process those projects as quickly or necessarily approve them. Also, a new recent development is you'll see impact fees are going up. Many jurisdictions right now, I think I'm aware of at least 5 or 6 jurisdictions, are in the process of updating their nexus studies, which is the necessary legal and technical foundation that allows development impact fees to increase. And so basically, the bottom line for developers is, at least in California, because we have the late vesting rule, is to use vesting maps or try to vest your development, lock in those the regulatory framework as early on as you can, because it could change and bite you in the you-know-what later. As our panelists are going to be discussing in more detail, required compliance with the California Environmental Quality Act, which is essentially a much stronger and more complicated analog to the federal NEPA framework, is being used more and more by attorneys to delay development for additional environmental mitigation money. For logistics facilities, they're really on to wanting solar panels. So CEQA risk is getting more and more acute. We, as you probably all are aware of, we're having some drought problems in California, and the state has taken action. John, I know Magnus is going to be talking about this in more detail, but bottom line here is if you're looking to buy a piece of land, you really need to do your due diligence with your water district to ensure that there is adequate water supply, because I think we're going to see very soon, because Governor Brown has mandated 25% reduction in water consumption from 2013 numbers. So we're going to see, I think, potential moratoria on water hookups. And without water, you don't have a project. So now with those cheery notes, let's open the discussion from our panelists. The first panelist I'd like to introduce to you is Troy Briggs. He's the Northeast Regional Director at Goodman Bircher, an international development firm. Troy, why don't you start by telling us about your role at Goodman Bircher and what you're working on and some of the regulatory issues you're facing.
Sure. As John mentioned, I'm the Northeast Regional Director, really focusing on the core markets, which is Central Pennsylvania, Lehigh Valley, and the New Jersey area. And I was talking with some folks last night. We were talking about the challenges that you have with entitlements, environmental, and they said, well, in Jersey, all you have to do is give them a bag of money, right? But that's not necessarily true anymore. But we're working on a couple of projects, and one is in Linden, New Jersey. It's a 143-acre site, 2.8 million square feet, and the other one is in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. So you have two states with different dynamics, and for the New Jersey, just to give you a quick background, in the 1900s, New Jersey was dominated by pharmaceutical companies and chemical companies. And then as we headed into the 1980s and the 1990s, and with the overseas and everything going to China, all those manufacturing plants shut down, which created a lot of brownfield contaminated sites in New Jersey. The site that we're working on right now is no exception. It's an old GAF chemical site, and it was in production from 1919 to 1991 when they shut down the plant. And so it sat there for another 10 years, and the seller decided, GAF Chemical decided, we want to clean this thing up. And they spent $68 million remediating the site, and that's tearing down the buildings. They got their soil, NFA, no further action letters on soil, no further action letters on ground. And so it was teed up to sell. And in 2013, that's when we met with the seller. We got this under contract, and originally it was a 90-day due diligence period and a 30-day close. We're still not closed as of in 2015. And there's a couple of reasons for that. When you're dealing with DEP and EPA and you're on a coastal flood zone, there's a lot of issues that you have. We had the soil, we had the ground, we thought, you know, our troubles are behind us and we're gonna be able to get through this pretty quickly. We weren't able to do that. With DEP, you still had to have your waterfront development permit, freshwater wetlands permit, and then you had to deal with the Army Corps of Engineer on the permit for the Section 404, which deals with wetlands and stormwater. And literally, our first meeting with DEP, we thought, we'll sit down, we'll go through this, we'll figure out all the issues, and then so we can expedite our approvals. Well, literally, there are 9 people on the DEP, and everybody was, this person dealt with stormwater, that person dealt with the wetlands, that person dealt with the buffer, and we had to navigate through all 9 of these individuals to get those permits. So the time factor was unbelievable, and we had great political support, still do, with Governor Christie's office, with the city of Linden, but it's just a long process to go through that with those agencies. The biggest issue that we ran into was when Hurricane Sandy hit, FEMA issued advisory flood maps that, because of the National Flood Insurance Program, they put many of these sites into what they call the V zone, a high velocity zone. And we said, well, what's that? What does that mean? It means, well, we're not quite sure if it's gonna hold, if those are the areas, but they did as a knee-jerk reaction, so people couldn't rebuild. You may not be able to build your residents back, and if you could build, the building standards were so great that you just couldn't afford to do it. So we had to sit there and wait. We were able to get the answer to get out of the V zone. We're like, great, now we can start construction, we can move forward. And they say, well, no, you're still in the LMWA zone. We're like, what the hell is a LMWA zone? We don't know what that is. And it's a limit of moderate wave action, meaning that you're still in the flood zone, but you know, it can cause a wave to a 1.5 to 3 feet. So we had to navigate through that and say, well, if we bring the whole site out of the flood zone, will that take care of everything? Yes, it will, but what you have to do is you have to apply for a CLOMAR. Like, all right. So long story short, we're doing that. We're working through that process, but that's what we're dealing with right now in New Jersey. Pennsylvania is a little bit different. It's not the environmental issues that concern us. It's the DEP again and EPA, and they're really focusing on 4 things. Stormwater management is a big one. 85% of your stormwater has to stay on site, so that's a cost. High quality wetlands, watersheds. They're increasing the buffer areas that you have to have. Endangered species with the spadefoot toad and bog turtles, and now there's a new one that Pennsylvania DEP is actually accepting. It's not endangered, but it's the long-eared bat has some kind of infection in it, and if you have a habitat for that, you've got to do your studies there and create habitat if you have them. So, those are the big challenges. The last thing I want to mention is my best friend and all of yours is the NIMBYs that we have to deal with. Not in my backyard, people, so we get a lot of opposition in Pennsylvania, and you just have to be prepared for that, for air quality, traffic, light pollution, those type of things.
Great, Troy. Thanks. That's very interesting. It's interesting you mentioned, we're going to talk about this, but I'm sure well, not about everyone, but there's a lot going on with the Corps and the EPA. They just recently introduced a new rule trying to define what a water of the U.S. is. So one thing about, a regulatory trends panel, you can do it every year, and every year is going to be different. There's, things are always moving at federal, state, regional, and local levels. So we kind of heard from an East Coast perspective. Now we're going to turn it over to Michael Murphy. Michael Murphy is with CenterPoint, Chief Development Officer of CenterPoint Properties, and he's going to talk about a couple of projects. He's going to be focusing on the Chicago area and then also, I think, Kansas City. I know we have a couple of slides. I don't know if they've been loaded, but okay, we can try.
Well, thank you. So I'm Michael Murphy, Chief Development Officer for CenterPoint, and really we work nationally, so we get the joy of working in multiple states here in California and other places. And I think as you have heard and know, and you'll continue to hear, there's no one size fits all. Everything is a little different. Every state, every municipality has a little different take on what their issues are and what their critical elements are relative to dealing with regulations. I think what we've done, and if you have the slide, I was just going to do 2 quick case studies. If you have them, if not, I'll just verbalize them. One is our park in Joliet and Elwood, about a 4,000-acre business park, 2 800-acre intermodals, one for the Burlington Northern Santa Fe, another for the Union Pacific. The BN intermodal was built on really the World War II's the TNT manufacturing location, that the Army actually manufactured TNT. There are still TNT bunkers that reside around the terminal itself today. So we acquired that site. It was a surplus site. So US EPA, pretty significant environmental remediation. Now, an 800-acre intermodal kind of lent itself for a nice encapsulation for something of this magnitude. That park is now developed with about 12 million square feet of warehouse distribution, notably 3.5 million square feet with Walmart. We've added the park to the north in Joliet, about 6 million square feet there, and again, the UP intermodal. And what I wanted to touch on, and was asked by the panel, 14 years later, the park is a raging success. We've generated a lot of tax. I think we've met a lot of the environmental concerns. So surrounding us is the Medewan Tallgrass Prairie. That's a 21,000-acre U.S. open lands prairie. And we have the Abraham Lincoln Cemetery. So we have some really sensitive neighbors who obviously are focused on what we're doing within the park. Truck traffic has clearly become an issue within the park. Both the intermodals together are doing about 3.5 million TEUs a year. And so truck traffic has become a big issue. The village of Elwood really had issues relative to truck traffic on Route 53. That's a main Illinois truck route that runs through their community. They engaged the Illinois Commerce Commission, the Illinois Department of Transportation, the Union Pacific Railroad, where we have a grade crossing that crosses not only the UP rail but into an intersection on 53. Safety became a concern. We spent really the last year and a half debating safety and what we could do to enhance the intersection. Ultimately, the Illinois Commerce Commission decided to short-term close that intersection. So that is short-term closed as we're evaluating what we can do to reopen that and find new means of ingress and egress. So the park itself has 3 main points of ingress and egress. Now that Walter Strawn Road is closed temporarily, I think ultimately we'll do some kind of a grade separation, but that's going to take a couple years. I guess the development silver lining is it's really highlighted the benefit of being inside the park and not outside the park. So it has helped us make some development deals. And I think the point of the story is it's not always the US EPA, it's your village, it's your municipality dealing with truck traffic and other related issues continue to be an issue as you develop out these parks and work to better define the logistics benefit and the development side. In Kansas City, we've spent, the Kansas City team, and Jim Cross is in the audience, we've spent 2 years with the Department of Energy on a 320-acre site, 5.5 million square feet, former National Nuclear Security Administration manufacturing building. We will ultimately, in the next year, transfer title, we'll demolish the building, we'll take it down, and then we will environmentally remediate the site. So 2 years, at least 50 agencies, from the US EPA to the Missouri MDNR, Jim Cross and the team have the patience of Job. But really the way we went after it, we've spent a lot of time, we've spent a lot of effort with them early on before we took title to make sure everyone was comfortable with what we were doing, how we were going to do it. Working with the U.S. government is always fascinating, but it's been a very positive, beneficial relationship, but it's taken a lot of time and effort. Understanding ultimately what our cost per square foot, what the redevelopment looks like is significant, and even the cycle time to when we can really bring the park back for redevelopment is certainly a consideration. So just 2 examples, one in Illinois and one in Missouri, of kind of how we go at the regulatory issues.
We in California think we have it bad. I don't think I've ever worked on a project with 50 agencies.
Yes.
Wow. That's got to be a lot of fun. Our next speaker is my friend and client, John Magnus, Senior Vice President and Western Region Director for Hillwood Investment Properties. John, please let us know what's going on at Hillwood and what type of issues you face in California. John specializes in their California portfolio and program.
Thank you, John. Hillwood is based out of Dallas, and I run the West Coast office. We've got about 5 million square feet under construction, 8 different cities, and every city is different, and every state is different that we're working in. I'm going to cover 3 topics, and then I'm sure there'll be more, and Fran can correct me where I'm wrong on all these because she knows a lot more about it than I do. But first is water, and if you hadn't heard that California is facing a water shortage, I guess other people have said it's really not a water shortage; it's a water allocation problem. 50% of the water coming into California goes out to the ocean. So if there's ways to fix that, there's ways to get that and capture that and use that. Desal hasn't even been thought of in 50 years here in California. It's gotten cheaper. Maybe that's a solution. Interesting enough, though, the governor's mandate of 25% reduction in use excluded businesses, excluded industrial properties. But we've been able to turn that into a slight advantage, and you guys can write this down because I think this actually works, and take this away from the conference. You can go into these cities and talk about the water reduction mandate by the governor, and in one city we're working in, we got a 25% reduction in the trees that we were planting. Now, I'm sure the greenhouse gas people won't like that, but there's always a trade-off. But those water-thirsty plants that the city is mandating us to put in, we're able to say, look, the governor wants us to use 25% less water. Maybe we can turn that into an advantage. Interesting enough, I read that here at this conference, you all are drinking water and coffee made with toilet water. No, I'm teasing.
That's Orange County.
That's Orange County? Okay. I didn't see anybody spit it up, but so that's a little bit on water. So we're kind of into new territory with that. Every project has been, for the last 20 years, required to do a water supply assessment to prove that your project has enough water for the next 20 or 30 years. Fran's going to correct me. So that's already in the books. That's already required. And then along comes the federal EPA and the Corps of Engineers on water and says we're going to regulate not only the rivers and streams and the blue lines that are already on the map, but now we're going to possibly regulate how you drain and how your water gets to the ocean. So everywhere along there, if you're going to recharge an aquifer, it's going to have a ripple effect. And if we're going to get ourselves out of this water shortage or water allocation problem, some things are going to have to bend. And there's always that theory of unintended consequences that one agency is going to mandate something that's going to affect us in other areas. The second to talk about really is air. And we have enough agencies here in California. We have 2 that heavily regulate the air that we breathe, and that's the California Air Resources Board and the AQMD, the Air Quality Management Districts. So these agencies, as I tell the people in my office, are here to put you out of business. And in essence, they're trying to regulate commerce or regulate land use through air quality. And so in California, you have to get through some of those sticky wickets of proving that your project, specifically the mobile source emissions from the trucks, because these warehouses that are replacing, and especially in infill, are replacing much, much dirtier uses, are now being tagged with, well, this is the source of all the mobile emissions from trucks. Well, the funny thing happened since 2007 there in California is actually accelerated in becoming cleaner and cleaner, such that the 7 different reporting stations in the Inland Empire in Southern California are all reporting 100% cleaner air since 2007. And such that we had in Miraloma, I think last year, which was supposedly the worst air quality, having no days with PM 2.5 over the threshold. So it's working. Private industry working somewhat with the governing agencies and municipalities are having the desired effect. The air is getting cleaner. It's interesting because I've heard that AQMD and the California Resources Board will not be happy until every truck is electric. I'm not sure what's that going to do to the power supply in California. Probably it'll go the way of the water supply at that point. So when I moved out here from Texas to California, and somebody told me on my first project I needed to do a traffic study. And I said, well, in Texas, you look out there and say, yep, there's traffic. Well, here, it costs you about $75,000 to $100,000 to do a study of what your traffic will produce. And so there's a disagreement between a lot of municipalities and our industry on how much traffic actually comes from our facilities. And so the regulators, AQMD in particular, has challenged our industry to say, your warehouses are producing more traffic. When they went out and did their study, went out and did their count. They counted facilities that had extraordinary amount of traffic at the peak season in certain buildings, and then they didn't count the buildings that, they didn't take the average. They took the wild extremes, and thus mandated that we use higher trip counts. What NAIOP was able to do was to prove to them that using that extreme, the 95th percentile, is not the way to do this. You have to use the mean, and you have to be able to use high cube studies and high cube counts. And if we can just stick to one standard like the Institute of Traffic Engineers, we could all agree with that is a scientific way as opposed to Google Earth, which is what AQMD did. So that's water and air. The last one really to talk about briefly is the litigation environment that we work in. So Hillwood's built 20 million square feet here in the last 10 years, and we've been sued on 2 projects, a total of 1 million square feet. That's pretty good. 5% of our hope I'm doing the math right. Fran will correct me. We've been sued on 2 projects. Both were related to CEQA. One was from and I'm sure they're not here in this room because they're not welcome in California anymore, was from a competitor trying to slow us down delivering a project in Ontario. The second was from this new phenomena of lawyers for hire, and it was Corey Briggs. And his, if you read some of the stuff that's out there about these environmental attorneys, so-called environmental attorneys, they are doing nothing but, it's a great business model, suing every project for $495. I believe you can file a CEQA claim on a specific project in a city that we built a 400,000 square foot building. His CEQA claim was that we violated CEQA. Nothing on traffic, nothing on greenhouse gases, nothing on water quality, nothing. Is just that we violated CEQA. So we said, hey, you can't sue if you don't say what you're suing for. We went to court, tried to get it thrown out, and the judge says, no, I'll allow that. There is no bar to entry. There's nothing. The bar to entry is so low for the California courts that you can sue on and just name CEQA as your complaint. It's unbelievable. But I tell you all this because we don't need any more competition in California. You need to stay out. All the developers who are thinking of coming to California, the returns aren't good enough here, and the problem. No, I'm kidding. It's actually very good. What happens though is the returns are better here. It takes sometimes a long time to get property entitled. We have one project that we've been working on for 10 years. Yes, 10 years. Might need to find a new consultant on that. But we have projects that some cities will take as few as 9 months to get entitled. So it really depends on what type of level of risk that these different cities want to take. Those are the 3 things I came to talk about. So Fran, correct me for everything I said.
Yeah, thank you, John. It is amazing that not only are the allegations that need to be made by a CEQA plaintiff petitioner are low, it's just the standing requirement is very, very low too. So I'm representing a client who's gotten a project approved in the city of Paris. Unfortunately, it's not the good Paris. It's Paris next to Moreno Valley. And the petitioner is a lawyer based in Davis. He has an organization that we deposed him, and it has 2 members, himself and his wife, in Davis. So there's like no geographic connection. Davis is probably 500 miles away. And we're thinking of making a motion to dismiss the case, but you would think it would be a slam dunk winning case, but it's the rules are so slanted in favor of having people being able to raise their grievances in the courts on CEQA grounds. So we'll get into that a little bit later. Our last panelist is Fran Inman, Senior Vice President, Majestic Realty Company. And I'll tell you, Fran is really is a real asset, not only to our panel, but to us here in California, because there's so many regulatory issues that we face in California, and she's basically, I know a lot of developers and NAIOP rely quite a bit on her expertise. So Fran, why don't you tell us a little bit about Majestic and some of the things you're working on now?
Well, thank you, and thank you to NAIOP for...
And correct Magnus, if he made any mistakes.
I have a couple of little notes here, but John's my buddy. I can't tell you how many hours we have spent on various panels with our regulators trying to explain our sector. So anyway, thank you for having me, and I'm glad you're all in Long Beach, and I hope a whole bunch of you went on the tour yesterday. I am a huge fan of the global supply chain, and so I'm delighted to share that. And anybody that goes on that tour, it's hard not to be awed by the sheer mass and scale. And then I know that my friend Bill Mongaluso was on a panel yesterday to kind of talk to you about the recent hiccup that we have all felt. And we're getting ready for another peak season here, so I'm not sure that it's how much better it's going to be, but hopefully Bill has that all managed up for us. So a little bit about Majestic. Our company is headquartered just up the highway here in the City of Industry. We're 67 years old, privately held. We have about 73 million square feet in our portfolio totally, and about 44 million of that is in California. We also have offices across the U.S. and have really expanded primarily with our tenants. So we went to Texas with a couple of our tenants, and we went to Georgia. Today, Georgia is our second largest market. It is a very, very hot market. We recognize the work of the ports down there, Port in Savannah in particular, being an operating port, has really taken aggressive mode, and for our sector, that's proven to be very, very helpful. So, as John mentioned, I spend an awful lot of time on regulatory issues, and I think that's kind of comes with the territory. I can tell you today, Majestic has 7 million square feet under construction, and 90% of that is outside the state of California. So I don't know if that goes under the category of the grass is always greener, but it certainly is challenging to build something here in California. And we build and hold, so we're very cautious to make sure that the project is going to have a good, useful life. So in addition to my day job at Majestic, I also serve on the California State Transportation Commission, where I am the loud voice for freight, and my commissioners all recognize the value. But it's often a topic that gets pushed to the side as we focus on our sustainable communities. And I have argued long and hard that we will not have sustainable communities unless we all have a successful solution as a part of that. So anyway, I'm also happy, Michael, to tell you that the California Transportation Commission prides itself on not closing intersections, and especially those that involve the flow of freight. So I do know my counterparts there in Illinois. So I'm proud that we've managed to at least work through enough solutions that we are not having to do that. So in addition to that, I serve on the National Freight Advisory Committee that reports to the U.S. Department of Transportation. And that committee was established because the last federal transportation bill, MAP 21, actually recognized the value of freight. No money, but at least we had a title. And for those of us that have been working on public policy issues, at least getting yourself a line and title is good. So there's lots of work to be done. What we have now, as Bill probably told you yesterday, is a supply chain changing very quickly before our eyes with the larger vessels. We have the cargo alliances. We've all lived through the labor agreement process, which was quite painful for most of us. Then we watched 34, 36 of those mega vessels sitting offshore and couldn't get in. We also are trying to work through the chassis reconfiguration of ownership and the chassis pools, and it's kind of tough when you've always done business one way and then all of a sudden say, whoa, we're not doing that anymore, but there's no one to really pick up the ball. So hopefully I'm hearing some solutions that are evolving, but it certainly is not a market that's matured. So we're looking at what does that mean for all our business. So I think really for Majestic, that's kind of been one of the driving forces. We spend an awful lot of time as students of the supply chain and engaged in these infrastructure discussions, trying to figure out on our tenants' behalf what's going to work for them. Because we all know today it's about throughput and velocity. We watch the retail sector very closely with the big question marks of what does omni-channel distribution mean for all of us, and how is that changing the different needs. And so we try to build in the flexibility. On the regulatory side, as John mentioned, water is a key issue here. And just one little correction, business didn't get a free pass. We're still mentioned in the governor's mandatory requirement, but at least our Water Resources Board has recognized that they clearly don't understand in one size fits all. So they started first with our residential, so each one of us, depending on where you are in your 400 water districts in the state of California and what your zip code is, have different requirements ranging from 8% cutback to 36% cutback on the residential side, with some pretty stiff fines as a little bit of a stick out there to make sure. So we've all cut back our watering to 2 days. There's huge programs to try to get us to change out and remove all the grass and plant more of our native drought tolerant. But on the business side, the category is called CII, which is commercial, institutional, and industrial. And sorry, John, thanks for...
Ed, she's busy right now.
That's pretty much how it goes at my hearings. Yeah, sorry about that. I apologize for not turning it off. Anyway, so we all need to be at the table and help our state water board as we work through, because we will have to reduce our consumption, and clearly there are different needs for different business types, and the across the board will not be healthy for any of us. So the other challenge I think we have on the state was, while there is a clear recognition of the importance of our agriculture community to our state and to the world, when we have the gridlock and the lack of investment in the infrastructure, it makes no sense to harvest the crops and then they can't get through our ports. And we have heard horror story after horror story of vessel cancellations and cargo getting rolled, and when you have an expiration date, that's tough. So anyway, our state has developed a state freight plan for the first time, which those of us in the sector working without a plan is kind of bizarre for all of us. But we're in the midst, the state finished theirs the end of the year, but at the same time, our Air Resources Board decided that they would develop a sustainable freight strategy. So most of the business sector is looking and saying, okay, I have 2 plans. That makes it more complicated. So we will see as they try to move through that. The biggest challenge, I think, for the commercial real estate sector right now is the push to zero emission in the transportation sector, and frankly, the technology at the scale and the duty cycle we need just isn't there. So we've got a long, long way to go with that, but the discussion and the proposals on the table talk about a facilities emission cap, and we're a little bit nervous in terms of what benefit that would bring. And since the warehousing sector's, triple net lease, and we're primarily landlords, it'd be very difficult for us, as we have no party to the contract with the beneficial cargo owners to even control that. So I would encourage all of you, as I mentioned, John and I spend a lot of time, but there needs to be a whole bunch more of us at the table. I like to say, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So I think that is very, very true. So I think the air challenges, the waters of the U.S., the recent ruling was described as a clarification. What our water experts are telling us is that there are just as many questions, if not more, that we've created. And some of my transportation partners have done some analyses to tell us that we will have impact areas that are 3 to 4 times greater than they were under the old way of doing business. So what that means, where you have very limited resources for infrastructure investment, is that more and more of those dollars and more time will be to getting the proper permits and the mitigation. So I think it's a challenge for all of us. I think it's kind of sad on the one hand that I spend a gazillion hours on the regulatory front, because you really think, gosh, we'd better be a lot more fun to be getting deals done, but it is truly part of the process. And I think for all of you, we need to formalize more engagement and figure out how to use technology to communicate with each other on a regular basis to really stay engaged while we're doing our businesses at the same time.
That's great, Fran. Let's have some discussion of some of these topics. Let's kind of enlarge the discussion. Looking at it, I think we could start from a micro perspective. Might be a little more practical for everyone. And obviously one way to try to attempt to minimize these regulatory risks is doing a robust due diligence at the front end before you actually are the proud owner of a property that cannot be developed due to regulatory problems. John, how do you what kind of activities do you do during due diligence? Do you do it all internally? Do you farm certain things out?
The biggest part of our development company here in California is on the pre-development side, and I'd have to say, and that was a softball question from one of our consultants or one of our attorneys, you got to hire a good attorney, good CEQA attorney. So, not to give Alan Matkins too many platitudes, but they are one of the best and have done well. Saw Kimley Horn here, Jennifer from Kimley Horn. They can, picking a good consultant early on can help you write that EIR. And do a good job up front. Counting every penny that goes into our overhead and counting every penny that goes into pre-development is important, but it can cost you much more on the other side if you don't do some of that pre-development due diligence work. So when we go to look at buying a piece of land, we'll probably overspend when it comes to trying to find the landmines. Literally, we found landmines on some of our property developing, but some of those things that can trip you up, and fatal flaws in the projects, and it's having a good consultant team and overspending on that tends to save you money in the long run.
Michael, how about you? What's your approach when you're doing land acquisition?
I think it's very similar. I think the other thing we do is we really try to sit with the county, the municipalities, understanding what their sensitivities are, beyond environmental, what are the infrastructure issues, what are the key elements, whether it's water, air permitting, because I think understanding that is critical. What we did in California with, the village of Manteca, really working with them, with Lathrop, a lot of infrastructure issues. I think one of the, it's good and bad. The what California does is you really look at regional impacts. You know, you've got this traffic impact fees. Obviously, you know, the fees per square foot are pretty significant in the greater California area, but at least if you feel it's a win-win for the county, the community, it's ultimately going to serve your client with better transportation, you know, back to the interstate. At least you can feel good about the dollars you're putting back in the community. Now, some of those go into other areas, but we spend a lot of time focusing on that, and then really looking, you know, as Fran mentioned, intermodal and port-related development is our strong suit. How do we ultimately derive a benefit that our client is going to see beyond just a warehouse in a greenfield, but a real supply chain benefit? So I think working through a solid team, you know, legal, environmental, engineering, but really embracing the community and trying to find something that works for everyone has been very successful for us.
And how important is it that when you're looking at properties to pick or avoid certain jurisdictions? Because there are a couple in Southern California which frankly scare the hell out of me, and I know if a client decides to buy property there, they're going to be in for a long, rough road.
I think it's critical. You know, in my 27-year career, I've only done 2 de-annexations. They were not pleasant, but they, at the end of the day, the 3 years it took us to de-annex and then re-annex, one in the county and one into a different municipality, really made the project successful. These were in Illinois. I don't recommend it, but you know, that's why you really want to do your due diligence up front before you take title, so you know what you're getting into.
How about you, Troy? What are your thoughts on that?
No, I agree with Mike and John and everything they said, but a couple things have come up with, you know, opposition out there, especially, you know, for us in Pennsylvania. We really take a look at the relationships in those townships, in those boroughs, and because most of those people are elected by the local folks, and so they have a big voice. And so when we take a look at a project, it's like, what do we have to do to engage the community? What can we do to try to mitigate some of the time that's going to be lost because we know we're going to have opposition? And it's a strategy, and we're dealing with that on a couple sites, and how we approach that, we're getting a little bit better each time. But the other thing that we look at now, because we ran into this, is that you have companies out there that I call title raiders, and they'll look for a big development company doing a big project, and they'll take down a small land parcel next to your project and basically try to extort money from you. So when you go in there, take a look at some of the parcels around you, and if you can tie those up, they have a tax lien on them or something like that, it might make sense for you to tie it up for $8,000 or $5,000, and that way somebody can't come in and do that to you. So we take a hard look at that now.
That's a good point. And you know, I have some clients who refuse to build a logistics project. They don't even look at a logistics project if it's near sensitive receptors, that is near a school or residences, even on the truck route. So I think those kind of issues are important. What about during the due diligence process? How much avoidance strategies do you look at? I mean, it's one thing to say, okay, we've got potentially a jurisdictional water here. Do you go through in your Proform Analysis, like Fran at Majestic? So, you know, wow, we better try to come up with a site plan to avoid that potential jurisdictional feature.
Oh, totally. And I think many of you know my boss, Ed Roski, but he loves complicated deals. So we kind of laugh if it's simple, it's boring to him. So we tend to have deals that are complicated and hairy and difficult. But I want to build a little bit on what Michael was talking about, some of the others, in terms of really getting engaged in your community. I'm very proud to be the founding president of our Majestic Realty Foundation. We have a Get On Board campaign as a part of that, and my colleagues at Majestic are all strongly encouraged to serve on nonprofit boards in their local areas. And I know John and I have spent a lot of time in the Inland Empire, and we've gone through a visioning process with our county where education is just a huge issue, and the lack of success in terms of educational attainment. And so I think for all of us to be recognized as really active stakeholders in our community is important. And I think that for all our businesses, we need a healthy workforce. So in the way you don't get that if your schools are all failing. The same thing in terms of violence. We looked at how much money we were spending to paint out graffiti, and it was like crazy. Could we invest this money in our community on a little different manner and try to get to some of those root causes and what can we do. So we're always pitching, nothing stops a bullet like a job. And so I think the jobs piece is so very important in our communities, and we've seen that. And we're in Bethlehem, and we certainly understand what it's like for a lengthy entitlement. Although I think Redlands probably took the cake for us in terms of a 10-year entitlement, and we actually did a carve-out of the now infamous donut hole, which was a direct result of a local city that absolutely today adores our shopping center, but fought it tooth and nails, and so we had to look for an open window, which in that case was, carving out and joining the county. So I think we have to be engaged in our communities. I think we have to be sensitive to what's going on in our communities on a much broader basis than just our core, because at the end of the day, it's all integrated.
Let me build on that for a second, Fran. A while back, say about 10 years ago, when Penny Newman and some of her Coalition for Economic Justice, I think is the name of her outfit, was suing every project in Riverside County. We got, started questioning ourselves as how can you fight back against, people who are trying to put you out of business using health care and air quality and dirty air, and you're killing babies, that type of, how can our industry fight back against that? One thing recently we did, and this is very transferable to other markets, we started an Inland Empire Logistics Coalition and said, the best form of healthcare is a job. Like Fran was saying, the best way to stop a bullet is with a job. And trying to change the dialogue, started writing op-ed pieces, trying to get out there and say, look, if people need health care and want to be healthy, if you have a job, you can pay for health care. Your employer can pay for health care. That seems to have been a lot more effective lately in the logistics community, developers, retailers, 3PLs all coming together to say we need to change the dialogue, we need to change the discussion, because without that, we're going to be put out of business. Remember, in Southern California, this is really the last job sector we have. They've already taken away steel, auto manufacturing, aircraft manufacturing, defense contractors, they're all gone. So we have logistics. So let's not put them out of business too. So trying to change the dialogue seems to be working, but it really does require a lot of people to participate and get that grassroots effort together.
Can I just jump back in there? What we found to be very, very helpful, we talk about the health risk of poverty. And for those of you that are having entitlement issues in terms of the environmental push, I think if you look at that study, which was done purely by an independent, very large nonprofit, on the health risk of poverty, the environmental issues were like number 8, behind not having a place to live, not having adequate nutrition, not having health care. And so I think for all of you, you could maybe build on some of the scar tissue that we have in our region, and hopefully we can share some of the things that worked.
That's a really good point, Fran, because it's really two-pronged. I mean, on the one hand, it is political. We need to be advocative, but we also need to be armed with technical data. And of course, NAOP Southern SoCal chapter and our chapter, the Inland Empire chapter, funded a couple of studies which have been very beneficial. One study focused on the economic benefits of logistics facilities, high-cube warehouses. The typical government line in California, especially the way local governments are financed in California, is all these facilities do is pollute the air and wreck up our roads. And what our study found by well-regarded economists was that these facilities have a tremendous economic benefit, not only on a macro level, but also on the city's fiscal picture. And we've also had an air quality study done, which indicates that even though the number of warehouses and logistics facilities have expanded exponentially over the last 10 to 15 years, that the amount of air pollution has actually dropped. So those kind of issues have to be in the forefront at all times.
John, I'd be interested in hear what the other market
Yeah,
sectors
that's a good idea.
have related to this, because I don't know of any other economies where you have a developer ready to spend $50 million to bring in a company who's going to spend $100 million, and then you got local opposition to it. And does that happen in other parts?
Spending 500.
Absolutely. I mean, well, to give NAIP a little commercial, I mean, I do think us banding together to really support development throughout the country is very important. I know each of the chapters do it. We've done it in Chicago, Missouri, throughout the country. You know, we've had issues with the NRDC, with the Sierra Club, and they come with their guns fully loaded. And it's those, you know, interfaces where the power of our industry really, I think, can be beneficial. And what we've done and the studies that have been done and the job creation, because it's easy to pick holes, you know, at projects, but I think when you look at the magnitude of what it's going to do for a local economy and jobs, it's pretty significant. And the environmental impact, in my opinion, from warehouse distribution is certainly significantly less than others. Now, we've done some manufacturing. We did a big manufacturing plant for the Department of Energy outside of Kansas City. That had significant local and state resistance because of the use, because of what they were doing. Obviously, at the end of the day, the jobs, the investment, won the day. It's 3,200 jobs. It's a significant investment for the Department of Energy, but it certainly had its detractors, and we had to battle through years, really, NRDC in federal court in Washington, D.C., to ultimately allow us to move forward.
Well, we have about 4 minutes left. I want to thank everyone for their time. Do any audience members have any questions that I know this panel has just triggered so much strong emotion. I can just tell by looking at everyone's faces.
Well,
Nobody?
doom and gloom
It's like Ferris
panel.
Bueller. Anyone? No? Okay, well, on that note, thank you very much. The next panel is going to be starting in basically 5 minutes. So thank you all for your attention.
Thank you.
So this afternoon I'm at the